Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee and do powerfully command thee, O Spirit. Elon, I, the Tetragrammaton, the Lord God Most High, I do exercise thee and do powerfully command.
In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the Abracast. We are the brave and the bold. Occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
Welcome to the Abracast. I'm your host, John Towers. Tonight we're going to be doing kind of veering off of, well, first of all, welcome back. Been off for a while unexpectedly. There's a bunch of shit. 2020 got me shook. We were talking about technical issues, mental health kinds of things, interpersonal life stuff. Yeah, all kind of life stuff caught up to me over the past month or 2 months or so. So welcome back. I feel good. I feel back. We're doing some new equipment shakedowns. So when I first started the podcast, I had like a big soundboard, and I got rid of that and tried to do some digital stuff, which wasn't working out with like the shitty USB microphones and stuff. So I need to figure out a third alternative. Anyhow, whatever. It's, the show started back in 2016, and I didn't miss a week. I didn't miss a week until I went on vacation earlier this year. And then this shit. So I feel like I've been slacking a little bit, but we're going to get back on track, everybody. This episode, specifically, we're going to be talking about the birth of Western civilization. And the main reason that I kind of wanted to talk about this is because I think it's ending. I'm pretty sure we're in the twilight of Western civilization. I feel like, the American stereotype, the cowboy or the soldier, riding off into the sunset, or, saving the day and getting the chicks and beating the bad guy, single-handedly. I think that's all done. I don't think that's who Americans are anymore. So I want to take a little while to look at Western civilization. We were, Western civilization has probably always been threatened, and when we talk about like our problems that we have, back in the day with Islam or the caliphate, is that Western civilization? I don't know. It's certainly monotheism, but does the rest of it fit? How does World War I and specifically World War II figure into Western civilization? How does the fall of the British Empire? What is that? Like, ultimately, when we're looking at this, I think what we're going to discover is that globalism is the end of Western civilization. I think that this is why everything's moving so fast, like politically, like Build Back Better, climate stuff. I think everyone is moving so fast because Trump really fucked everything up with Make America Great Again. The American First policies, I think, really fucked the globalists up. Now we have to deal with the environmental, social, political scores, the metaverse. All of this stuff is just being ran. I mean, let's not even get started on Papers, Please, and all of that stuff. So I wanted to sit back and, in our own way that we do things here, kind of think about the birth of Western civilization. In the Exodus episodes, we are ramping up very quickly to the issuance of the Ten Commandments. And that probably gets folded into like the preconception of Western civilization. And we've talked at length about Western philosophy, Stoicism, Epictetus, and this sort of thing. And those things definitely probably are like the into the preconceptions of Western civilization as well. But I wanted to find like a definitive point on it, right? I wanted to find like where it started. And the point that I wanted to find was it coming off of something else, like things do. We've discussed on the show, and oftentimes I recall, like in some of the history episodes, we talk about how in some ways World War II is just a continuation, or it came from obviously the aftermath of World War I, how 9/11 came from the Soviets being defeated in Afghanistan in the 80s. How things resolve and it starts something else. So I wanted to find like in an instance that something had gotten resolved where Western civilization, sort of as we know it, rolled out of that resolution. So obviously I found a comic book. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, The Black Dossier. Alan Moore here is writing as the character named Oliver Haddo. And Oliver Haddo is the universe of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Oliver Haddo is sort of the analog to Aleister Crowley. So he writes this article called "The Descent of the Gods," and this is where I chose to pick up at. Some few thousand years later, by the Bronze Age, we might readily suppose that the surviving residue of these opposing astral forces might have undergone the ordinary mutations of time and heredity, resulting in their transformation to the Titans and other prototypical giant race that populate the early stages of the world's nascent mythologies. There would themselves time give rise to the great plethora of more sophisticated and more fully realized spiritual energies, which became known as the classic gods when manifested to various cultures of the ancient world. It is with the various pantheons of this classical era, Babylon, Greek, or Egyptian, the gods of which great civilizations would often appear to be the selfsame energies as conceived by the marked differing cultures, that we first have some sense of divine agenda, and through these interactions between mankind and its deities, though just as profligate in the fathering of half-human chimera as their celestial predecessors, the more cultured deities inhabiting the Greco-Roman world would seem to have had some occulted purpose in their promiscuity, perhaps a hoped-for hybrid race that would one day conceivably provide a bridge, a bond between the mortal world and the ethereal, by means of which communion between man and his divinities may be more certainly effected. This concealed agenda is borne witness by the brief proliferations of the half-god race of heroes, men like Hercules or Heracles or Aeneas, just as surely as the Trojan War in the 10th century bears witness to the failure of that divine project. If Homer is to be believed, the siege of Troy was engineered by the Greek gods, the goddesses, deliberately to call the hero race that they themselves had sired decades before, only to see the hybrid's human qualities collapse between the weight of their divine inheritance, producing vain and strutting homicidal monsters. It may be that was the tragic end to the preliminary experiment that caused the gods to gradually withdraw from the material domain across the coming centuries, perhaps to ponder some new strategy by which their aims might be achieved. The different pantheons retreated one by one into their home dimensions, so that eventually only the Teutonic deities remained, these being obliterated by some terrible ethereal catastrophe during the 6th century AD, and events mirrored in our own realm by a collision with a piece of meteoric rock dust darkening the skies for several years. Ragnarok and roll, Ragnarok and roll. So my entrance point that I chose to focus on is the Trojan War. And not saying that Western civilization is a leftover experiment for making heroic god people, but the Trojan War, the story of the Trojan War, is important to Western culture, Western literature. Why is the Trojan War so important to Western culture? By Nielsen. The conflict itself dates to a period sometimes called the Greek Dark Ages, and also sometimes called the Heroic Age. So there is already some ambiguity about the historic period in which the Trojan War occurred. It was dark. Was it dark or was it heroic? The Greek Dark Ages is that period of time in ancient history when the general collapse around 1200 BC that took down almost every civilization in Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant, except for Egypt. The collapse was so severe that literacy was lost over much of the area. Some scholars think that the epic Greek poems we have received from this period, like the Iliad or the Odyssey, were a product of an oral tradition that was passed down through the Greek Dark Ages and survived until the recovery of literacy. And hence these works of literature being copied down subsequently to be transmitted into to posterity by manuscript rather than oral tradition. Oral tradition is highly selective, and it also changes a bit with each generation's retelling of the tradition. So I think the Iliad and the Odyssey became the vehicle in which stories and ideas could be passed along through the Greek Dark Ages to subsequent generations because of the oral form. Is parsimonious. Only the best bits made it in and were preserved, hence the overall high quality of these poems and their lasting appeal. Add this to the fact that the poems came to be regarded as mythical, and for a couple of thousand years were connected to actual facts of Greek history had been broken. When Heinrich Schliemann started digging Troy up in Mycenae, it was a sensation. Not only did he find and largely destroy geographical and topographical features mentioned in the poems, he dug up a lot of artifacts, including gold jewelry fit for a king, and gold death masks, which came to be known as the Mask of Agamemnon. There we go. Not surprisingly, this was a sensation. So the Trojan War is celebrated as a famous poem that came to define Western literary canon. Artifacts that testify to the historicity of the Trojan War were found when the poem was used as the basis of archaeological excavations, and subsequent research has given us much more knowledge about this important period of Greek life. Not only the epic scale of the war itself and the legends it inspired, but also the epic story, the transmission of this tradition, and eventually rediscovery of the factual basis of the Trojan War all make for a great memorable story. And it is a story that lies at the foundation of Western civilization. So when Westerners take the time and the trouble to dig up the origins of their own tradition, they find this great story and how this great story has been preserved. So we're going to jump over to, this is the opening of the epic poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which had a little bit of a jolt, spike in popularity this year due to the movie. So this is the opening of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. After the siege and the assault of Troy, when that burg was destroyed and burnt to ashes, and the traitor tried for his treason, the noble Aeneas and his kin sailed forth to become princes and patrons of well nigh all Western Isles. Thus Romulus built Rome and gave the city his own name, which it bears even to this day. Dictys turned him to Tuscany, and Langobard raised him up a dwelling in Lombardy, and Felix Brutus sailed far over the French flood and founded the kingdom of Britain, wherein have been war and waste and wonder and bliss and bale oftentimes since. And in that kingdom of Britain have been wrought more gallant deeds than in any other. But of all British kings, Arthur was the most valiant. As I have heard tell, therefore, will I set forth a wondrous adventure that fell out in his time. And if ye listen to me but for a little while, I will tell it even as it stands, the story stiff and strong, fixed in the letters, as it hath been known in the land. All right, let's talk about the fall of Greece, the fall of ancient Greece. This is from Greece.mrdon.org. This is a somewhat brief, simple, and concise history lesson. So, the time period called Ancient Greece is considered by some historians to begin the Greek Dark Ages around 1100 BC and end when Rome conquered Greece in 146 BC. The other historians start with 776 BC, the Greek Olympic Games, after ancient Greek had formed themselves into hundreds of independent Greek city-states, each with their own way of doing things. It's safe to say that the ancient Greek culture covered a lot of years. Ancient Greece was at its pinnacle from 776 BC to 146 BC for a very short period of time. Within the pinnacle of ancient Greek city-states were pulled together under one rule. Not their own rule, but the rule of Alexander the Great. He fought foes from Phoenicia, and to Gaza to Giza, and I got Turkey and Iraq in my expansion pack. Alexander the Great conquered the ancient Greek city-states in 338 BC. Alexander ruled for about 13 years. Alexander died young. He was only 32 or possibly 33 years old. He was off conquering other lands when he died. He respected and admired the Greek culture. He felt it was his mission to spread Greek culture to other lands. During his rule, Alexander spread Greek culture throughout the Persian Empire, including parts of Asia and Africa. After his death, the ancient Greek city-states did not regain their independence, but the teachings of Alexander remained. The Hellenistic age was the time after Alexander's death, when the Greek culture mixed with various cultures of Alexander's empire. This was the time of advances in learning, math, art, architecture. Some of the great names of learning of this age included Archimedes, Hero, and Euclid. It was a time of relative peace. The Hellenistic age began with Alexander's death and ended about 200 years later when the Romans conquered the Mediterranean region and beyond. The ancient Romans attacked the ancient Greeks at the Battle of Corinth. That's where you get Corinthian leather. The Romans won, but the Romans loved the Greek culture, especially the Greek gods and the Greek myths, just like Alexander. The Romans adopted all the Greek gods and their myths, changing them a bit to reflect the Roman way of life. As long as the ancient Greeks agreed to consider Rome in charge, the Greeks were free to mostly manage themselves. Even their language remained the same. Once again, the ancient Greek culture survived and, in fact, expanded as the Romans expanded into Europe. They brought with them Greek culture, which then they claimed was Roman culture. The Romans often did that, adopt something and pretend it was Roman all along. Alexander spread the Greek culture all around the Mediterranean, and the Romans spread the Greek culture into Europe. And Greek culture is still influential today. This is why historians say ancient Greece never really declined, but it did fall. So here we go. We got from Greece to Rome. We talked about the Greek Empire falling in the ancient Greek time. We're going to talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, and this is from ushistory.org, Ancient Civilizations. The invading army reached the outskirts of Rome, which had been left totally undefeated. In 1410, the Visigoths, led by Alaric, breached the walls of Rome and sacked the capital of the Roman Empire. The Visigoths looted, burned, and pillaged their way through the city, leaving a wake of destruction. Wherever they went, they plundered, continuing for 3 days. For the first time in nearly a millennium, the city of Rome was at the hands of someone other than the Romans. This was the first time the city of Rome was sacked, but by no means the last. Constantine and the rise of Christianity. One of the many factors that contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire was the rise of a new religion. Christianity, the Christian religion, which was monotheistic, ran counter to the traditional Rome religion, which was polytheistic. At different times, the Romans persecuted the Christians because of their beliefs, which were very popular among the poor. In 1313, the Common Era, Roman Emperor Constantine the Great ended all persecution and declared toleration for Christianity. This is where Constantine claims that he saw a giant, fiery cross in the sky, and it convinced him to convert. Later in that century, Christianity became the official state religion of the empire. This drastic change in policy spread this relatively new religion to every corner of the empire. By approving Christianity, the Roman state directly undermines its religious traditions. Finally, by this time, Romans considered their emperor a god. But the Christian belief in one God, who was not the emperor, weakened the authority and the credibility of the emperor. So along with Christianity, it's not like a block. Like Christianity at this time wasn't a block, and you have to. Well, I like to think of the Gnostics are rolled up in there, especially with the Hellenistic Gnostics. So they're the ones that will use the Greek gods or something like them to talk about their ideas of Gnosticism, not necessarily a Christian Gnostic. But, their ideas of rulers had to be, subversive, especially if the ruler is sitting there talking about how he's God. Look, bro, I'm God. And these Gnostics have to be sitting there like, wait a fucking second, what are you even talking about? Their idea of God, the creator God, is being evil, and then the emperor sitting here saying, no, I'm God. And they're like, yes, it's like a as above, so below moment to these Gnostics that are stuck in Rome. All right, anyhow, enough babbling. Constantine enacted another change that helped accelerate the fall of the Roman Empire in 330. He split the empire into two parts. The western half centered in Rome, and the eastern half centered in Constantinople, the city he named after himself. It's now known as Istanbul, as you know. The Western Empire spoke Latin, and was Roman Catholic. The Eastern Empire spoke Greek and worshipped under Eastern Orthodox branch of the Christian Church. Over time, the East thrived while the West declined. In fact, after the western part of the Roman Empire fell, the eastern half continued to exist as the Byzantine Empire for hundreds of years. Therefore, the fall of Rome really refers only to the fall of the western half of the empire. We've talked about Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire a lot when talking about our Crusades episodes. Mm-hmm. Other fundamental problems contributed to the fall. Okay, so let's pay attention to these things. The fundamental problems that contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. Let's see. An economic ailing, a decrease in agricultural production, higher food prices. The western half of the empire had a large trade deficit with the eastern half. Wow. This is all brand. I've never heard of anything like this before. The West purchased luxury goods from the East, but had nothing to offer in exchange. To make up for the lack of money, the government began producing more coins with less silver. This led to inflation. Finally, piracy and attacks from Germanic tribes distributed the flow of trade, especially in the West. There were political and military difficulties as well. It didn't help matters that the political amateurs were in control of Rome in the years leading up to its fall. Army generals dominated the emperorship. And corruption was rampant. Over time, the military was transformed into a mercenary army with no real loyalty to Rome. As money grew tight, the government hired cheaper and lesser reliable Germanic soldiers to fight in Roman armies. By the end, these armies were defending Rome against their fellow Germanic tribesmen. Under these circumstances, the sack of Rome came as no surprise. Wave after wave of Germanic barbarian tribes swept through the Roman Empire. Groups such as the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Angles, the Saxons, the Franks, and the Ostrogoths, and the Lombards all took turns ravaging the empire, eventually carving out areas in which to settle down. The Angles and the Saxons populated the British Isles. The Franks ended up in France. In 476 CE, Romulus, the last of the Roman empires in the West, was overthrown by the Germanic leader Odoacer, maybe? I don't know, who became the first barbarian to rule in Rome. The order that the Roman Empire had brought to the Western Europe for 1,000 years was no more. So we touched on it. Let's get into it, right? Christianity and Western civilization. Something we want to talk about here to remind everybody, if you're interested in topics like these, you might want to check out the Genesis and the current Exodus episodes that we're doing. You can find them on the featured topic link at Abracast.com. Okay. Judaism, which originated in ancient Israel, represented the foundation of much of Western civilization's traits, thanks to its relation to Christianity. It impacted the West with in a multitude of ways, from its ethics to its practice of monotheism. All of its benefits largely impacted the world through Christianity. The Hebrew Bible, authored by Jews in the land of Israel from the 8th to the 2nd century BCE, is a cornerstone of Western civilization. Around 63 BC, Judea became part of the Roman Empire. Around 6 BC, Jesus was born to a Jewish family in the town of Nazareth. And decades later, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. His followers later believed that he was resurrected, inspiring them to spread the new Christian religion through the world. Christianity took hold in the Hellenistic Greco-Roman world, which eventually grew into the entirety of Europe thanks to Roman expansion. These nations later became the very foundation of today's, quote, Western world, unquote. Christianity, the religion of the West and essentially the religion of the Western world, grew from Judaism and began as the Second Temple Judaic sect in the mid-1st century. The New Testament, authored by 1st century Jews, is one of the bedrock texts of Western civilization as well. So we talked about the Roman Empire basically splitting into two sides. The Roman Empire limps along and eventually falls from the Visigoths and the Vandals and the Saxons and the Lombards and so forth, and the Byzantine Empire limps along for a little longer. So, as I mentioned before, the featured topic links at Abracast.com for the First and Second Crusades and so forth will give you a little bit of context about the Byzantine Empire and what they went through during the Crusades and the fall of Constantinople. Istanbul was once Constantinople. Why they changed it, I don't know. Maybe they just liked it better that way. Early Middle Ages and Western society. Middle Ages, an overview. This comes from courses at .lumenlearning.com. The Middle Ages, or the medieval period, is a stretch of European history that lasts from the 5th until the 15th century. It began with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and was followed by the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. The Middle Ages is a part of the middle period of the traditional division of Western history into classical, medieval, and modern periods. The period is subdivided into the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, and the Late Middle Ages. The early Middle Ages, depopulation, de-urbanization, and barbaric invasions. Wow, sounds really familiar. Which began in late antiquity, continued. The barbarian invaders formed new kingdoms in the remains of the Western Roman Empire in the 7th century, North Africa and the Middle East. Once part of the Eastern Roman Empire by the Byzantine Empire, became an Islamic empire after the conquest by Muhammad's successors. We have talked a lot about the rapid expansion of Mohammedism or Islam after Muhammad's death. The rapid expansion, they tried for a long time to take Constantinople, and we kind of get into some of the strategies and tactics there in some of those episodes I mentioned earlier. Although there were substantial changes in society and political structures, the break with antiquity was not complete. The still sizable Byzantine Empire survived and remained a major power. The empire's law code, the Code of Justinian, was widely admired in the West. Most kingdoms incorporated extant Roman institutions, while monasteries were founded as Christianity expanded in Western Europe. The Franks, under the Carolingian dynasty, established an empire covering much of the Western Europe. The Carolingian Empire endured until the 9th century, when it was succumbed to the pressure of invasion. The Vikings from the north, the Magyars from the east, and the Saracens from the south. During the High Middle Ages, which began in AD 1000, the population of Europe increased greatly as technological and agricultural innovations allowed trade to flourish and crop yields to increase. I see this word and I keep wanting to just say Mandalorianism. Manorialism, the organization of peasants into villages that own rent and labor services to the nobles, and feudalism, the political structure whereby knights and lower status nobles owed military service to their overlords in return for the right to rent from lands and manors. This is what's coming. This is it. By 2030, you will own nothing and you'll love it. Everything is going to be a subscription service, bitches. You just wait. We're two of the ways society was organized in the High Middle Ages. The Crusades, first preached in 1095, were military attempts in Western European Christians to regain control of the Middle Eastern Holy Land from the Muslims. Kings became the heads of centralized nation-states, reducing crime and violence, but making the ideal of a unified Christendom more distant. Intellectual life was marked by scholasticism, a philosophy which emphasized joining faith to reason, and which by the founding universities, the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, the paintings of Giotto, the poetry of Dante and Chaucer, the travel of Marco Polo, and the architecture of Gothic cathedrals such as Chartres are among the outstanding achievements of this period. The late Middle Ages were marked by difficulties and calamities such as famine, plague, war, which much diminished the population of Western Europe in the 4 years from 1347 through 1350. The Black Death killed approximately a third of the European population. Controversies, heresies, and schism within the church paralleled the warfare between the states and the Civil War. And peasants revolted, occurring in the kingdoms. Cultural and technological developments transformed European society, including the late Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period. Although the political structure in Western Europe had changed, the divide is not as extensive as some historians have claimed. Although the activity of the barbarians is usually described as invasions, they are not just military expeditions that were migrations of entire peoples into the empire. Such movements were aided by the refusal of the Western Roman elites to their support of the army or to pay the taxes that would have allowed the military to suppress the migration. The emperors of the 5th century were often controlled by military strongmen such as Stilcho, Aspar, and Ricimer, or Gundobad. And when the line of Western Empire emperors ceased, many of the kings who replaced them were from the same background as those military strongmen. Intermarriage between new kings and Roman elites was common, led to this fusion of the Roman culture with the customs of invading tribes, including the popular assemblies, which allowed free male tribal members more say in political matters. Material artifacts left by the Romans and the invaders are often similar, with tribal items often being obviously modeled on Roman objects. Similarly, much of the intellectual culture of the new kingdoms was directly based on Roman intellectual traditions. As important differences was the gradual loss of tax revenue by the politics, many of the new political entities no longer provided their armies with tax revenue. Instead, allocating land or rents meant that there was less need for large tax revenues, and so the taxation systems decayed, and warfare was common between and within kingdoms. Slavery declined, and was as the supply declined and society became more rural. Between the 5th and 8th centuries, the peoples and the powerful individuals filled the political void left by Roman centralized government. The Ostrogoths settled in Italy in the late 5th century under Theodoric. They set up a kingdom marked by the cooperation between the Italians and the Ostrogoths, at least until the last years of Theodoric's reign. The Burgundians settled in Gaul, and after an earlier kingdom was destroyed by the Huns in 436, formed a new kingdom in the 440s between today's Geneva and Lyon. This grew to be a powerful kingdom in the late 5th and early 6th centuries in northern Gaul. The Franks and the Britons set up small kingdoms. The Frankish kingdoms was centered in northeastern Gaul, and for the first king of whom much is known is Childeric, who died in 481. Under Childeric's son Clovis, the Frankish kingdom expanded and converted to Christianity. The Britons, related to the natives of Britannia, modern-day Great Britain, settled in what is now Brittany. Other kingdoms were established by the Visigoths in Spain, the Sevi in northwestern Spain, and the Vandals in North Africa. In the 6th century, the Lombards settled in northern Italy, replacing the Ostrogoth kingdom with a grouping of duchies that occasionally selected a king to rule over all of them. By the late 6th century, this arrangement had been replaced by permanent monarchy. With the invasions came new ethnic groups into the parts of Europe, but the settlement was uneven, with some regions, such as Spain, having a larger settlement of new peoples than other places. Gaul's settlement was uneven, with the barbarians settling much heavier in the northwest than in the southwest. Slavonic peoples settled in Central and Eastern Europe. Into the Balkan Peninsula, the settlement of the peoples was accomplished by changing languages. The Latin of Western Roman Empire was gradually replaced by languages based on but distinct from Latin, which are collectively known as the Romance languages. These changes from Latin to this new language took many centuries and went through a number of stages. Greek remained the language of the Byzantine Empire, but the migrations of the Slavs added Slavonic languages to Europe. Okay. The society in Western Europe changed with the new rulers. Some of the Roman elite families died out, while others became more involved with the church and secular affairs. The older values of Latin scholarship, the education mostly disappeared, and while literacy remained important, it became a practical skill rather than a sign of elite status. In the 4th century, Jerome dreamed that God rebuked him for spending more time reading Cicero than the Bible. In the 6th century, Gregory of Tours had a similar dream, but instead of being chastised for reading Cicero, he was chastised for learning shorthand. By the late 6th century, the principal means of religious instruction in the church ceased to be by book and was replaced by music and art. Most intellectual efforts went towards imitating classical scholarship, but some original works were created along with the now oral compositions. The writing of Sidonius, of Apollinarius, of Castrodorus, and Boethus were typical of the age. All right, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to skip down through all this language stuff. Okay, so the next section that we're going to talk about is sort of where we should have been talking about anyways. We're getting back to Byzantium. This article is called Constantinople, the Last Hope. This is by pressbooks.nscc.ca. As noted in the last chapter, the eastern half of the Roman Empire survived for 1,000 years after the fall of the western one. It carried on most of the traditions of Rome and added many new innovations in architecture, science, religion, and learning. It was truly one of the great civilizations of world's history, and yet demonstrated in everything from college curricula to the representation of ancient and popular culture. The Eastern Empire, remembered as Byzantium, is not as well represented in the contemporary view of the past as the earlier United Roman Empire. Why might that be? The answer is probably this. Like the Western Empire before it, Byzantium eventually collapsed. However, Byzantium did not just collapse. It was absorbed into a distinct culture with its own traditions, and that of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Much to the point of the religious divide between Christians and Muslims, at least from the perspective of medieval Europeans, was so stark that Byzantium was lost to the tradition of Western civilization in a way that the Western Empire was not. Even though the Ottoman Empire itself was proudly Western civilization, one that eagerly built on the prosperity of Byzantium after quote, absorbing it. There is a misguided century-long legacy of distinguishing between the Byzantine and Ottoman culture of the East and the Roman, European, medieval culture of the West. Byzantium civilization's origins are to be found in the decision by the Emperor Constantine to found a new capital in the Greek village of Byzantium, renamed Constantinople, or Constantine's city. By the time the Western Empire fell, the center of power in the Roman Empire had long since shifted to the east. Simply put, by the 5th century CE, the majority of wealth and power was concentrated in the eastern half of the empire. The late Golden Age and the final decline. Byzantium's last period of strength was under the Macedonian dynasty, lasting from 867 to 1056. A murderous leader named Basil I, originating from Macedonia, seized the throne in 867 and initiated a line of ruthless but competent leaders who governed for about 200 years. After the Macedonians, Byzantine territorial lines were pushed back as part of Mesopotamia and Armenia in the east, and Crete and Cyprus in the Mediterranean. An important effect of these reconquest was trade. Once again, Byzantium was at the center of international trade network stretching across Europe and across the Middle East, and vastly enriched Constantinople as its region, leading to the Renaissance in building and art. Under the patronage of Macedonian dynasty, some ancient learning was revived as scholars trying to find a way to make the work of the ancient Greek masters compatible with Orthodox Christian teaching. During the late Golden Age, Constantinople's population rebounded with food supplies guaranteed by the imperial government. Even the poor lived better lives in Constantinople than the relatively well-off in Western Europe, much of which was barbaric by comparison. The elite class of administrators occupied social positions, somewhat like the ancient Egyptian scribes that were educated in Christianized versions of Greek learning. The classics, one scholar named Photius produced an encyclopedia of ancient Greek writing that is the only record of many texts that would have otherwise permanently been lost. These happy times for Byzantium ended when Emperor Basil II died in 1025 with no male heirs. Simultaneously, a series of bad harvests hit the empire. Byzantium's military success was based on the themes, which were in turn based on the existence of reasonably prosperous, independent farmers. Bad harvests saw those farmers vanish, the land swallowed up by the holdings of wealthy aristocrats, and as it happened, the Roman Republic so long ago, the problem that there were thus no soldiers to recruit, and the armies shrank. Likewise, the relative calm of the Macedonian period ended with the rise of a new group of invaders from the east. We know this group very well, the Seljuk Turks, a powerful group of nomadic raiders from the western part of Central Asia. The Turks had converted to Islam centuries earlier, despite having no centralized leadership. The Seljuks themselves were just one of the dominant clans with no real authority over most of the fellow raiders. By about the year 1000, they began invading both Byzantium territories and those of their fellow Muslims, the Arabs. And over the next few years, the Turks grew in power, steadily encroaching on Byzantium's territories in Anatolia. Fewer independent citizens meant fewer good soldiers, and the armies of Byzantium thus became dominated by foreign mercenaries paid out of the imperial treasury, representing an enormous financial burden for the empire. Another disaster occurred in 1199 when Constantinople itself was invaded and sacked by the Crusaders during the Fourth Crusade. From Western Europe, who were supposed to be sailing to fight in the Holy Land. We know about this, I believe. The Holy Land for about 50 years. Byzantium, already reduced to a fraction of its former size, was ruled by a Catholic king. Even when the king was deposed and a Greek dynasty restored, nothing could be done to recapture the lost territory. The Muslim empires that surrounded Byzantium occupied its territory until Constantinople fell in 1453 to the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, with it the last vestige of Roman civilization, founded over 2,000 years earlier on the banks of the Tiber River in Italy, ceased to exist as a political reality. All right, I hope you guys had a good, safe, happy Christmas and New Year's, and we'll be catching up with you soon. Remember to check out Abracast.com, the storefront, tarot cards, the t-shirt. I'll just let Hilla tell you about it.
Thank you for listening, and we hope that you enjoyed the show. Please send an email or find us on social media and let us know what you think about the show. We would appreciate it if you would give us a 5-star rate and review wherever you find your favorite podcasts. You can find Stigmata Studios, graphic, novels, and comic books. Take control of your destiny. Understand your past. Put your present in context and know your future with a twist. Check out the Abracast Tarot Card Deck. Your body is your temple. So let's make sure you got a badass t-shirt on it. Variety of cool occult themed t-shirts and other merch like stickers, wall art, mugs, and more. Welcome to the Red Archive. Get access to over 50 hours of archived episodes, more bonus audio, additional exclusive content. All this for only $1 a month. Are you interested in the occult, history, conspiracy, and violence? Learn more at Abracast.com.